Thanks. So hi everyone, I'm happy to be here to present work done at UMich with my advisor Mike Wellman. And so I'm going to set the stage a little first with the discussion of the nature of financial regulation. And it's via this cartoon from the New York Times. So there's a guy saying that they locked the door after the horse got out. And the regulator response says, it's not true, I still haven't locked it. And then there's horses running around. But, you know, it's not really that funny of a comic, but it does illustrate 2 points, right? So the first point is that financial regulation tends to sort of lead from behind, right? So it often takes a real crisis for regulators to get the impetus and the momentum to get some new regulation through. And the second point is that we still aren't really sure what happened in 2008. There's still a lot of disagreement about the main causes. And so what we're left with is a set of financial regulations that are really just an extension or a more strict version of what we had before the crisis, right? And so it's really important to evaluate these regulations because if we don't get it right this time around, we'll really have to wait for another crisis, probably, before we're able to address it. All right, so let me first talk about leverage. So leverage it's a key accounting variable used by everybody in finance to measure financial health, right? And so imagine you have a fund and he has $6 in assets, right? And to buy those $6 in assets, he's taken $5 in debt and he's used $1 of his own money. Okay, so the leverage is just simply defined as the asset value of 6 divided by the $1 of wealth. Okay, so basically the more of a fund's investments are funded by debt, the higher its leverage is going to be. Oops, sorry. So let me first talk, so a key form of risk control by lenders is to force funds to limit their leverage. Okay, so consider these two funds. One of them, so both of them own $6 in assets. One of them has used $3 in debt to fund that purchase. One of them has used $5 in debt. Okay, so here's their leverage ratios. And so now imagine the price of the asset gets shocked. So it goes down from 1 to 5 or 6. Both A and B's asset values are now 5. But A is okay because he still has $2 in wealth left. And his leverage just goes up slightly. Whereas B is not fine. He has no defined leverage ratio because he's now in default. He owes $5 and has no wealth. So you can think of leverage as saying, the higher leverage is, the closer you are to default, the more susceptible you are to shocks to your portfolio, right? And so lenders, even without the help of regulators, will set some cap on what your leverage can be to protect themselves against this default. Basel regulation, which is what we got after the financial crisis, it goes a little further and it says that in times of high asset price volatility, you have to have a more stringent leverage limit, where you is the bank. The bank is forced to implement more strict leverage limit. Okay, so it kind of makes sense. It says, when times are dangerous, you must protect your credit lines more. Okay, so our goal is to evaluate how well this this regulation is going to perform, but we can't really do that on a real financial system, right? So we're going to rely on an economic model. And so we were inspired by this agent-based model used by Paletta and Thurner to give this counterintuitive result that Basel is actually bad for financial stability. Okay, so, and it does this given just a set of perfectly rational funds, and it models the sort of how leverage changes over time and how leverage limits can be harmful. Okay, and so we replicated this result independently. The whole model is due to Paletta and Thurner, but we're going to extend the model to take into account the strategic interactions. So when funds are allowed to choose their leverage choice in a strategic manner, we're going to find out we're going to reverse this counterintuitive result. All right, so in this model, agents buy and sell a single asset with the goal of accumulating wealth. And the basic idea is for funds to form a new price every period based on the aggregate demand for that asset. Okay, so to do a price update, the price is first shocked randomly every period with this slightly mean reverting noise, where the mean that it reverts to is just the fundamental value of the asset. Okay, so you can think of these as a collection of poorly informed investors who go in and like do some random thing, but collectively they kind of go back to the mean. Okay, and we're going to label that fundamental value V. Okay, so within each period, the market clears by matching supply and demand using price, and between periods, the funds carry over the wealth that carry over the profits that they made in the form of wealth, and the funds can augment their ability to invest by borrowing from a single lender, which is the bank. Okay, so now how do the funds behave, right? So what is their investment rule? So first, all the funds know the exact true fundamental value. So given that knowledge, really their job is to look for situations where the price is not at the fundamental value, right? So when there's a mispricing opportunity, and they're going to invest in the opposite direction. So when there's a negative price shock, the funds are going to buy the asset, and when there's a positive price shock, the funds are going to sell or short sell the asset. But they do that at varying levels of slope, right, according to their aggression. So here you have mispricing signal on the x-axis, and you have two funds where the blue fund is more aggressive than the red, right? And you can see that the blue fund, you know, he responds much more quickly to the same mispricing signal. Okay, but okay, so in that diagonal region, the funds are using a mixture of wealth and debt to fund their investment, but the debt is not an unlimited resource, because remember, the bank is going to put a cap on the leverage that each fund can take. So if left alone, the banks are just going to implement this cap, lambda max. Under Basel, the cap is going to change according to sigma, which is the asset price volatility. But it's not going to go above lambda max, because then the bank would step in and say, oh, well, I don't want to lend to anybody with that bad of a leverage ratio, right? So, so due to this cap, you see that there's a common level of maximum investment in either the short or the long direction. And that's just when the fund has taken the maximum amount of leverage he can. So even though they have different aggression levels, they're subject to the same constraint. And so if they have the same wealth, they have the same max and min amount of investment. Oh. Okay. Okay, so in this model, the funds are really working to keep the price stable, right? So every time there's mispricing, they try to return the price back to the fundamental. The banks are trying to prevent the funds from defaulting, but somehow we're going to see that crashes are going to be generated, and not only that the Basel regulation is going to make it worse. Okay, so how is this going to happen? So let's run through how this happens, right? So suppose we have two funds. One is aggressive, which is A, and one is passive, which is P. I'm going to show the wealth of the funds in green and leverage as a percentage of their max in red. And so when the red gets up to the dotted line, that means they're at their maximum leverage level. And then I'm going to show an overpricing here in purple. Okay. And so that you can think of that as just the size of the price shock that they're trying to return. So they start out pretty like the same amount of wealth. So if there's a shock to prices, A is going to respond much more quickly and take on leverage, right, to take a bigger position. And P is just going to kind of take a little bit. And then as this happens, they're going to return the price back to the fundamental. And A is going to make more profit off of this situation because he took more leverage and took more risk in the first place. So the mispricing is gone. And so this could happen again, right? Another price shock happens, and now you can see that the aggressive fund is much bigger than the passive fund. So in normal times, most of the wealth is going to accumulate in this with this aggressive fund. Okay, so now there's another price shock, and A is happily, taking on more leverage. But now let's say there's another price shock. So every price shock that goes. So remember that A is now buying a bunch of assets. He's holding the assets. And every time there's a price shock, the assets are decreasing in value. A would like to buy more because he knows that the price is now way out of line with the fundamental. But he cannot because now he's over the leverage limit since his wealth is degraded with each price shock. Okay? So, but it's no big deal, right? Because A is friends with the bank and he can just negotiate with them and say, I'm going to sell some of my assets to bring my leverage back in line. But once he does that, he exacerbates that price shock, right? Because he's selling when he'd really rather be buying to return the price back to the fundamental. And he exacerbates that shock and degrades his position even further, and now he's in default, and P is pretty close to default. Right, and now remember that Basel can only make this leverage limit lower, so the phenomenon becomes more pronounced under Basel, and so that's why in this original study they found that Basel decreases financial stability. It makes prices more volatile, funds default more frequently, the funds earn less profit, but they are smaller at the time of default because the leverage limits have been more stringent during this dynamic. And we independently implemented this and replicated it. But now you should be feeling a little bit funny about these demand functions, right? Because it seems like the agents are given the opportunity to take on leverage, but they're only given this fixed linear demand the entire duration of the simulation, right? And these are smart funds, and they can respond however they want, and really. They should be allowed to choose their aggression level at least. So the financial stability outcome is definitely going to depend on this distribution of aggression. And so what aggression level should A and P pick? To answer this question, we're going to analyze the whole scenario as a game and have aggression as the strategic parameter. And I'm kind of just going to skip over this part, but we have a method to search over a large profile space. So there's about 90,000 profiles that are required for just 10 agents and 10 strategies. And we get an equilibrium level of aggression under Basel and unregulated. And so here are the results. So you should notice that, in the original study, the distribution was uniform across all of these strategies. You can see that by allowing them to pick their aggression levels, these are highly non-uniform aggression distributions. And in addition, they're not uniform in a particular way. In a systematic way, whenever Basel is applied, you can see that the mean aggression is getting lower. Okay? And what is the effect of this? I'm kind of going to skip over this as well. But the summary of the findings is that when you allow the aggression profile to change, you get these results, right? So you get a lower default rate, you get a lower loss per default, and you get higher fees in most cases. Okay, and you don't change price volatility by that much. When there's a regulation shift, we just replicate the results of the previous study, right? And in aggregate, we reverse the finding that the default rate increases with Basel if you allow the aggression level to shift to strategic levels. And so you still get lower fees and higher price volatility, but defaults and losses per default come directly from the pockets of the taxpayer, and so that's a strong finding for keeping Basel around. Kind of going to skip this, and in the interest of time, much time do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. Okay, actually, I will not skip that. So this finding basically hinges on the fact that Basel encourages more passive fund behavior. And so let's sort of discuss why this is, right? So the first thing is that the first thing that's happening is that when you place more stringent leverage limits on funds, you put pressure on them to find not just any mispricing and leverage up on them, but to find the best mispricing opportunities, right? So you can imagine that an aggressive fund is going to use up his entire leverage budget on a series of just small mispricings, whereas the passive fund is just kind of wait around until like really large mispricings come out, and then they're going to leverage up and take those. And so you can imagine that these less aggressive funds are going to trade less, but they're going to make more for each trade. And the second reason that funds would decrease their aggression under Basel is that, so given the same aggression profile, Basel is going to cause more defaults, right? And so to shield yourself against these defaults, a useful tool is to be more passive, okay? So there's these two effects, and in aggregate, you make the environment less susceptible to default. And so to conclude, I'm going to go to this slide. And so basically, if we take into account strategic regulation, we can kind of see that Basel is more robust to analysis than we thought. And also, I've seen a lot of great agent-based models this week already, and I think it's cool that we're pushing the frontiers of economics with these models. EGTA, this method for analyzing agent-based models as a game, is kind of in the same spirit of loosening assumptions that are very hard to loosen just using pure analytical tools. And so, thank you with that.
Thank you.